Some breaking news now. New fallout after the Supreme Court blocked a key part of the president's plan to address climate change, with the Obama administration vowing to push ahead with efforts to curtail greenhouse gas emissions, even while the court is potentially slowing down or perhaps stopping the process altogether. The Supreme Court granting a stay request for more than 24 states and utilities and coal companies after they claimed the regulations amounted to a, quote, unprecedented power grab. Joining us now, Judge Andrew Napolitano, Fox senior judicial analyst. And the White House coming out with some comments just over the last few minutes, Judge, on this and a gaggle that's taking place as the president is in flight today. You say, though, when we just take a big step back about this story, this is a historic decision by the Supreme Court, one that is rarely, if ever, made. Tell us about why it's so significant.
The EPA announced new rules for the amount of carbon that coal-fired plants can emit into the air. Now, when the EPA issues a rule, after 30 days, it takes effect, and you start following it if you're one of the regulated industries. And if you challenge the rule is enforced even while you are challenging it. So it stays in effect during the litigation challenging it. So after the EPA issued this rule, and after a number of coal-fired plants and 29 states challenged it, the court decided that the rule would stay in effect. These challengers then appealed that decision to the Supreme Court of the United States, and yesterday it did something it has never done in history. It reached down to a lower court and said, you, lower court, will prevent the EPA from enforcing its own rules while they are being challenged. That has never happened before.
Why do you think it did, Judge, in this case?
Because the last time the Supreme Court overturned a decision of the EPA, it took $10 billion in costs for the entities that were regulated to comply with a rule that the Supreme Court eventually threw out. So rather than making these power plants waste all these billions, because when you're regulated by the EPA, you pay the EPA for its costs of regulating you, rather than making these people do this for a rule that will probably be thrown out anyway, the court has decided to bar the enforcement of the rule during the pendency of the litigation, something it never did before. The EPA is supposed to be filled with experts, scientists who know what they're doing, and therefore there's a presumption that what they do is lawful. The Supreme Court effectively yesterday reversed that presumption.
Okay, but the Supreme Court doesn't have to give any sort of an explanation as to why they're doing this. They don't have to write down and say this is precisely why we're doing it and making it public. So at the heart of this ruling by the EPA, not the Supreme Court, but the initial ruling that the president pushed through, this is supposed to be part of his legacy.
Right.
What apparently is the issue between the federal government and the state governments that could be causing a problem down the road, and that's why we're seeing this action taken by the court?
Great question, Jenna. There are two issues. One is, when the Congress wrote the Clean Air Act, did it intend for the EPA to impose regulations on coal-fired plants so onerous that the plants would have to shut down and go out of business? Two is, when the EPA requires the states to be the enforcing entity for the EPA rules, is that taking away discretion from the states? Is it forcing the states to do something that they, as sovereign, independent governments, wouldn't choose to do on their own? Those are the two issues the Supreme Court is interested in hearing.
Is it pushing the states too far, the EPA, based on if you're the judge, and you are the judge, which is why we like you and we book you to talk about these issues. Is the EPA crossing the line, Judge? Is there something wrong with the regulations that have been put into effect beyond just the environmental questions, just in the power between the federal government, the EPA, and the state government?
Just last year in 2015, in a similar set of facts but under a different statute, the Supreme Court slapped down the EPA. So if the Supreme Court rules consistently on this case as it did just a few months ago, I think the EPA will lose. I think it has gone well beyond where Congress intended it to go. It intended it to keep the air clean, but not at the price of closing these places down.
Well, and that's why there's so much at stake here, because we're talking about jobs, we're talking about moving entire industries to different sources of power as well. And that causing an upheaval perhaps in some of the local economies. Not perhaps, but that's what it would do. And there's, of course, the debate over whether that's right or wrong, which is not what we're debating today. But it's all the more reason to pay attention to see what happens next.
Yes.
Judge, always great to have you on the program. Thank you.
Good to be with you.